without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, the Reverend Ruth Gouldbourne. Reverend Ruth Gouldbourne has been a Baptist minister for 35 years. She's been the minister of the Bunyan Meeting Free Church in Bedford, the minister at Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church in London, and she's currently the minister of Grove Lane Baptist Church in Cheadle-Hulme. Ruth's also been tutor in church history and doctrine at Bristol Baptist College, and she is a senior research fellow at the International Baptist Theological Study Centre in Amsterdam. She's contributed numerous articles to many journals, such as Baptist Women and Ministry in Feminist Theology, published in 2017, Reinventing the Wheel, 25 years on, in the Journal of Baptist Theology and Context, published in 2022. And she's also contributed to many publications, Ministry in Conversation, Essays in Honour of Paul Goodliff, published in 2022, and with Faith Bowers in Baptist Worldwide, also published in 2022. Ruth is also the author of The Flesh and the Feminine, Gender and Theology in the Writings of Caspar Schwenkfield, published in 2007. And with Anthony Cross, she's the author of The Story of Bristol Baptist College, 300 Years of Ministerial Formation, published in 2022. So this evening, we'd welcome the Reverend Ruth Gouldbourne with her talk, Deaconesses, A History Hidden in Plain Sight.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, everybody. When you list what I've done like that, it all sounds incredibly scattergun. But a lot of what I do is in response to things. And so, as indeed this has been, although this is forming part of what I hope will be a much bigger piece of work that I will get to in due course. But it started for me in 1988. I had the huge privilege of attending the first EBF Congress to be held behind the Iron Curtain. It was held in Budapest, and that was still a thing at that point. And for me, it was the first time I had the chance to meet a lot of Baptists from other parts of Europe. And there were many strange and wonderful encounters in those days, but one that surprised me very much was meeting for the first time Baptist deaconesses, complete with uniforms and veils. They were from West Germany. They lived in community. They were addressed as sister, and they were very strange to me. And previously, I'd only ever heard of sisters as Roman Catholic or possibly High Anglican. And it felt very odd to find them in my own family, or at least that part of my family rooted in a different culture and context, but sharing sharing a great deal of similarities. Now, it was weird because, as I eventually realised, I was actually at that point working with a deaconess. I was still in my initial training, and I was doing an extended placement at Bloomsbury in London, and I was working alongside, in particular, the assistant minister there, one Barbara Stanford, who, as I would have known had I paid attention, was, or at least had been, a deaconess when there were such things in the Baptist Union of Great Britain. And indeed, when I was ordained later that year, I received a letter from my Scottish Baptist grandfather, who was never entirely reconciled to my being a minister, what with being a woman. But he wrote to me very graciously to assure me of his prayers, and in the letter said that my father had convinced him that I had the gifts that he recognised from knowing deaconesses at the large Baptist church to which he belonged in Edinburgh. So I'd obviously come across this, but how had I not noticed it? How had I only come to realise that deaconesses were a thing not only in Germany and other foreign lands with other histories, but in both of my home contexts, in Scotland and in England? Well, it could be that I'm peculiarly blind, and there have been those close to me have assured me that for an intelligent woman I can be very stupid. Or is it not just me? And is our history of deaconesses, this story of this form of service in our denomination, its impact and the impact of its loss, is this indeed a history hidden in plain sight? I have some pictures to show as I go along. They're not brilliant, and some of you will recognise some of the pictures. Ian, I've pinched them from the book. But I want to start with this one. From the early sisters, the order, and then this is a group at the closing service in 1976. And still, the uniforms are still there. They've changed, but they're still there. The Baptist Deaconesses, as so much in Baptist life, kind of started by accident and then took on a shape. There were at least 2 local initiatives that we can see as forming a kind of route. And in 1890, as part of the Forward movement, the church's attempts as the 19th century drew to a close to think about how to respond to a rapidly changing and largely unchurched society in the cities, which had grown so fast. In that year, a house was bought in Doughty Street in London to house several what were called sisters, on a model that was already being worked at amongst Anglicans and Methodists. There were 4 sisters plus a superintendent, and they ran and worked from a medical mission in Leather Street in London, at a bit of a distance, and they lived together in Doughty Street. And as well as being involved in the medical mission, they were responsive to the kind of needs that they simply encountered. And so they were soon visiting people in homes, and then they were supplying needs like coal and healthy food and layettes and training in nutrition and budgeting. And they got going on leading meetings for women and evangelistic meetings, and it all kind of grew and developed without anybody trying to stop it or shape it. It was a response to what was going on around them. And at roughly the same time, several local churches were looking at ways of meeting the immediate need in their doorsteps, especially in slum areas. So, for example, because it's the one I know about, in the middle of the 19th century, Bloomsbury had a domestic missionary to work in Seven Dials, which was a notorious slum area at that point. And by the mid-1870s, he had working alongside him a sister who did much the same work as the Doughty Street sisters. And according to Faith Bauer's history in 1876, in that year, she made 2,598 visits and had many conversations. I don't know what they were, but she had a lot of conversations with people, and she got married in 1888 and left the work. But the work continued. Church ladies, led by 2 elders' wives, carried on visiting the women in the area. And the Sick Poor Relief Society, which was the development of the work, was still making 3,000 visits a year in the 1880s. Now that mission out of Bloomsbury closed down in 1896, right up, and the mission sisters had led it right up until then. And the Deaconess House in Doughty Street and the work in Bloomsbury were amalgamated in the following year, and Bloomsbury became the kind of spiritual home for the Deaconesses, and the house in Doughty Street was continued as an important part of the centre where people were living together, and the movement gradually coalesced and got itself organised. And in the later developments of the work, I've got another picture. Where was it? In the later developments of the work, the Deaconesses ceased to work out of a house separate from a local church, and Bloomsbury was one of the first, and was in the end the last church to have a deaconess on staff. These are 2 of the Deaconesses from Bloomsbury at various points. You see that they're wearing the bonnets and the uniforms. And Bloomsbury was the last church to have a deaconess, and Barbara, whom I mentioned at the beginning, who was referred to by Dr. Payne, who was then General Secretary, as the last deaconess standing. And I wanted just to, that's the Deaconesses in 1907, just to stop at this point and reflect a little bit on what's going on in that movement before I do a little bit more about how it developed. The new movement was both spontaneous. It started in Doughty Street in Bloomsbury without any immediate, they weren't sort of working together to do it. They both organisations kind of started and then came together, and in various other churches at the same time. And it at least in Doughty Street, it was part of this broader initiative, the Forward movement. And it was all to do with responding immediately to a rapidly changing society, and a recognition that the way things had been done were no longer functioning effectively. That is, just as we see, for examples in Baptist beginnings, as people explored how to be a church when they let go of the existing parish and priestly model, and they developed new patterns. So here, there was a responsive, creative, reflective, energetic intention to respond, to find new models, to explore new patterns to respond to something very different. And on the whole, Baptist churches have been strongest in villages or small towns, contexts where the congregation was drawn from a solid, secure working class, the artisans, the small business. And later, as the nonconformist community got established, got effective in its business, there were significant businessmen and their families who supported it. But by the later part of the 19th century, there was the sense that as a movement, there was a lack of connection with the growing impoverished slum communities, which had grown so rapidly because of industrialization and urbanization. And what we might recognize from Dickens, I mean, Dickens died in 1870, and the stories he told were drawing from the life that he saw and remembered in these impoverished communities. And they were the places in which Baptists and other churches were recognizing they had very little connection. And the Deaconesses, the Baptists and the others, were quite intentionally a way of trying to meet new needs and pioneering new contacts and find new ways of expressing the gospel, and significantly new ways for women to serve. But specifically at the moment, I want to notice that what these women were doing at the very beginning was in many ways that generation's expression of the same impulse that we see now in so many of our new and often very exciting models of ministry. And the reason I want to pause on this is not to criticize the new forms of ministry in any way at all, but to point out we have a significant history of this kind of ministry, of doing things that are different from what we've done before to meet the need that's in front of us. And somehow we're not making the connections. I was delighted to hear when I was writing this that when parish nursing was first being explored, the story of the Deaconesses played a part. But I just wonder what else we might discover for our current expression, for example, of pioneering, or of new ways of being church, or of all the things that really matter as we in our generation attempt to deal with our rapidly changing context and a largely unchurched society, and need to find new entry points for all aspects of the gospel, serving and proclaiming. We've done it before. We've done it through the Deaconesses. But knowing this and reflecting on it and owning it might give us something really important. And it's not about copying it slavishly, because that's kind of losing the point of changing to fit new circumstances, but rooting it and giving it identity and content to what we're doing now, not as something we're having to pull out of the ether, but as something that's part of an ongoing story. Anyway, a deaconess house continued. It moved to different locations at various points in the early decades of the 20th century. Number of churches being served increased. The work in the medical mission continued, but in other local churches, there was less emphasis on the medical side and more on addressing the meetings, building up the women's meeting, preaching in the open air, working with the children. By the beginning of the 20th century, for women who were going to become deaconesses, there was a 3 to 6 month training, both academic and practical, hospital visiting, preaching, elocution, Bible study, theology, first aid. And these women weren't paid because their training and their accommodation was suitable remuneration in an era when women generally did not live away from home. So they didn't need to be paid, because what would they spend it on? In 1902, the annual report makes reference to open-air meetings, working with Spurgeon's College students. But the comment is, I quote, "The principal part of our sisters' work, however, is not that of addressing meetings, but in visiting the homes of the people. For 5 hours almost every day, this work is undertaken, so that over 5,000 personal visits have been made during the year. Up winding stairs, along miserable, dreary passages, and into poor, wretched homes our sisters go in their Master's name and with his message of salvation. They are living illustrations of the infinite pity and boundless compassion of God. They go to succor and help, to heal and to save." Now, maybe there's just a hint of the ladies, God bless them. But notice when it's being said and what is being said. This is in 1903. That's the year that the WSPU is founded. The role of women in public space is being deeply disputed. Women are trying to get a voice. They didn't get a vote until 1918. And the first woman was elected to Parliament at that point. The University of London had started awarding degrees to women in 1878. Oxford and Cambridge had allowed the establishment of women's colleges in 1860s and 70s, but no degrees were awarded by the universities until, well, it was 1920 in Oxford, 1948 in Cambridge. But in 1903, these women were out there doing this. They were gaining visibility. In general, women were gaining visibility, were gaining a voice in public. And here were Baptist women preaching on the streets and knocking on doors in slum areas and making themselves visible and available. By 1914, the work had expanded to assisting with the caravan missions of the Baptist Union. The Deaconesses were doing the door-to-door preparatory visitation. They were holding open-air meetings. They were working with children. And when the mission was well received, often a deaconess would remain in the area to develop the work. That is, to plant or to nurture a church. And that became a regular practice. In 1935, J.R. Ewing, who was writing in the Baptist Times, wrote this: where a church has no minister, the value of a deaconess is still more pronounced. Perhaps the neighbourhood is a new one. A chapel is to be built and a church formed. Here a deaconess can do useful preparatory work. We have instances in which a deaconess has been engaged for a time to live in a new estate, to go around the homes of the people and interest them in the coming cause. The result has been the gathering of a nucleus for a new church and Sunday school. In 1919, the Baptist Union took on responsibility for their order. There was a home and a college, with a committee to oversee both and to care for the work and the placement of the women and to care for them individually, all formally now part of the union. Let's see if I can have another picture that... This was the mission in 1901. This was in Guildford Street, where they had a clinic and held evangelistic meetings. And here are women leading services, a dedication service and a women's meeting. Because the work, by the time we're getting up into the middle of the early part in the middle of the 20th century, the work is mainly in local churches, usually alongside ministers, doing youth work, doing women's work, doing community work. So many of the ministries that we learn to value today and we're developing ways of doing. But there was also a trend towards deaconesses settling in small or even dying churches. They were paid less. They didn't need to be housed. They had to find their own accommodation. So their availability for small congregations was easier. And they often rebuilt congregations. And today we might call them pioneers, or we might call them interim ministers. Various points the college moved. I had a photograph of one of... Ooh, that's not what I wanted, beg your pardon. I had a photograph of one of the college buildings. Well, that's it. Whoops. Well, that's a new deaconess. Oh, I've lost the one I was looking for. But the college moved and they went to different houses. But by about 1954, it was clear the Deaconess College couldn't continue as a separate entity, that there just wasn't enough resource to support it. And at that point, so in 1954, there were 50 serving deaconesses, there were 11 probationers, there were 7 students. And the majority of the serving deaconesses at that point were in pastoral charge of congregations. Now, by 1954, the union had formally recognised women ministers, and there were several, although actually there were several on the list. But by 1954, there was only one active, and she was principal of Carey Hall in Selly Oak, which was a mission college for women. And it was decided that would be an appropriate place for the deaconesses to train, and the Deaconess College was dissolved into Carey Hall in 1955. And the training continued there until things changed at Carey Hall and it was no longer suitable. And at that point, Bristol College became the main place of training in 1967. And that coincided with a rising sense of the need to clarify the relationship between deaconesses and women in ministry. In fact, during the 60s, 4 deaconesses, including the organising secretary, which is one of the very senior posts in the order, Margaret Jarman, sought recognition as ministers because that's what they were doing. That was the work they were doing. And there was also a significant article by Gwyneth Hubble, who was the principal at Carey Hall. And in 1961, she had argued, and she was a Baptist minister, the only one who was at that stage was active as a minister until this next group came in. But in 1961, she wrote an article in which she argued the existence of an order of deaconesses has been for us as a denomination an escape route by which we have avoided facing the real issues of women in pastoral ministry. And we've been content, because of the shortage of male ministers, to let women do the work of a pastoral minister and call them by another name. And I say, when she wrote this, Hubble was training deaconesses. She was the only woman on the active ministerial list, and she was not in a congregational setting. Possibly, though this is conjectural, but it's not just me conjecturing, because churches were not willing to call women as ministers, though they were happy to have deaconesses. Now, the move to Bristol worked in terms of training, and there's a lot to say here, but this isn't really the place. But the training was similar to that which the men had who were training for ministry. The emphasis on theology, on teaching and preaching and ministry, and much of what had been the practical side was diminished, though youth work training was still there. But a much more significant academic grounding. And the women, like the men, were doing courses both within the college and the university, and there was quite a range of options that they took. But the other thing that became clear as the training was located actually in a college beside men training for ministry was that quite a few of the women who came into training were not sure whether they were called to be ministers or deaconesses. And quite a lot came in as open option and moved, and Carol, you can tell us about that, moved to be ministers. And the numbers entering the order were falling. And this confusion about roles and calling was quite significant. And as the 70s opened, the whole raison d'etre of the order was being questioned. Now, Nicola Morris has written a very good study of the history of the Deaconesses, and in it she quotes in the May 1970 Deaconess Committee meeting minutes, "The Council of Deaconesses agrees that it's logical we should be recognised as ministers. We do see reasons for the continuance of the order, and we would be sorry to let it go. But if it is to be for the benefit of the churches and the denomination, we would be prepared to consider this." And they were right that people were unwilling, but over the next month, that was the way the decision went. It felt quite inevitable. I think Morris shows by various quotations the way that the discussion went. And one sister convinced several with this statement, that they must be ready and willing to change if it is God's will for the denomination. So in 1971, it was decided to stop recruiting. And in 1974, there was a vote on transferring en bloc to the ministerial list. And again, Morris charts it. 6 wanted to remain deaconesses, 4 wanted to seek ministerial recognition, 7 were unsure. And she continues, although the deaconesses were unsure about becoming ministers, the minutes reveal that the majority recognised it was inevitable, and indeed they said they would act upon any recommendation of the Baptist Union. In 1975, all active deaconesses were transferred to the accredited list of ordained ministers serving the Baptist Union, and a letter was sent to all such deaconesses informing them of this. And there was a service to give thanks in 1976, and at Assembly in 1977, Dr. Payne, on becoming president, encouraged them to share their stories and encouraged the denomination to recognise those stories. And he said that the Baptist Union should be proud of the deaconesses, but he also said this: their Baptist pride must be touched with a bit of shame, because so many stories that have been told have behind them a great deal of heroism and heartache, because quite frankly, we have not, as a denomination, given them adequate support or recognition. Fortunately, there have been a few far-seeing people who have sought for better conditions and a wider understanding. Because you see, we have so often let these women do some of the jobs that frankly daunted some of the men, and they have done them splendidly. And now at last the Christian Church is ready to give a much more adequate recognition to women. But do not let us forget those who have been the pioneers. Which brings me neatly to the question of historiography, that is, the history of the history, and the way in which we have so often forgotten these pioneers. I wrote about deaconesses when I wrote about women's ministry for the Whitley Lecture in 1997, and I found various things in the archives. Various histories that were around at the time all commented, this is an unknown story. And the work that's been done since, most notably, as I say, by Nicola Morris, has continued to be cast in this light and to be correct in this. The story is told, but it never seems to gain traction or be held in our collective ministry. And it feels like a kind of gap in our self-telling of our own story. In that wonderful, Ian's amazing book on the 20th century, he writes a lot about Baptist deaconesses. And yet there will be those who tell you, who know about being Baptist, that they've never heard about the deaconesses. And as we've explored what it is to be women in ministry in my generation, and in the generations after me, we've sometimes seem to be seeking a history. And yet this one, on the whole, doesn't seem to have stuck. It doesn't seem to have achieved a place in a collective memory in ways that would make it effective. I'm not convinced that what I'm going to say tonight will change that, but it's an oddity that I think is important to note. A history is about a collective identity, a sense of belonging, not being weird, not having to justify ourselves, and being part of something bigger than ourselves. And it matters. And somewhere along the line, the story of the Deaconesses, individually and as a movement, could offer us that, and yet it hasn't done so. Now, 1991, Karen Smith, who's here tonight and be able to tell us more about it later, wrote an article for the Quarterly called Beyond Public and Private Spheres, and she reflects in that on the lack of women's stories in our history. And she argues that the earliest, I quote, the earliest of our histories do lack stories of women, but also the stories of most men, since the emphasis is on ministers. Now, that changes in the 20th century, but the histories continue to be institutional and therefore do not contain much from or about women. And then there's been a rise in interest in women and their history, and an emphasis largely on individual stories, what we might call a female version of the great man model of history. So we pick out individuals and we tell their stories, like Violet Hedgers, like Edith Gates. And that's great. It gives us our stories, but it still has an institutional bias. Who's deciding that an individual is great? It's usually someone who's made an impact in the institution. And Karen also argues that the traditional division into public life male and private life female has not served the history of women well, since the records of public life are much more accessible and are also more valued. It's also significantly a division that's unsustainable, particularly in terms of the story of faith communities. And she demonstrates some of the issues that we have with the sources, that official records are kept by men, the resources for researching history therefore need to be broadened. And it's true, the Deaconess records are scanty in places, especially the early days, but definitely not more so than some other parts of our story. We're quite good at working with scanty records when we really want to. Nicola Morris, in her opening chapter, also considers the matters of records, and she discusses the issue of the records of women's work and lives being written by men, others being written by women in power rather than on the ground, written by the superintendents or the principals of the college. And there are, she notes, other forms of records. There's the annual reports, the pamphlets, the newspaper articles, oral history recordings. She points out that many of the pamphlets are both sentimental and propagandistic. Worth noting, the minutes of the Deaconess Committee refer not to publicity, but to propaganda. They actually use that term. But Morris suggests because of that, they may not be realistic. But they, and the letters to and the articles in the Baptist Times and other publications, give a glimpse of how the Deaconesses were regarded. And Morris also points out that the relationship between feminist history and religious history, or the history of religious women, is not straightforward. Feminists tend to regard religion as oppressive and miss the experience of empowerment. And for more on that, worth reading Linda Wilson's writings, where she explores the issue of the church as offering a third sphere, neither public nor private, and giving women a place to operate. But Morris, in order to gain a fuller picture, used a questionnaire among surviving deaconesses in the early 2000s. And she did this in order to retrieve bits of the story that can be lost. It was a kind of form of research and history that's long been advocated by feminist historians. But she points out it does have the self-confessed problem of eliciting new information, but not a new methodology. Faith Bowers, in her history of Bloomsbury, made a very definite decision to tell the story of that congregation as exactly that, a story of a congregation, not just the ministry. And added to that was her personal connection with the final deaconess, as well as access to papers of previous deaconess, whose son was later a member at Bloomsbury. And so there was a personal connection in the history and an impetus to tell it. And she tells a lot about the deaconesses in that congregation, deliberately non-institutional history and making the most of a personal connection. And in Ian Randall's book, he has effectively engaged with this story. And again, a conscious choice to include it because he's writing at a time when it's assumed these stories really matter and they need to be told. But that aside, it's noticeable that apart from Morris's work and the 50th anniversary written by Doris Rose, who was a deaconess, as far as I can find, there has been nothing published about the deaconesses alone. Now, I could be entirely wrong here, and please tell me because I want to know about it. But I can't find anything else, and I'm really interested in this. This is a history hidden in plain sight. Nothing I've said is hard to find, and yet we barely tell it. Now, Karen and Nicola both offer reasons why women's history, and in the case of Nicola, the history of the Deaconesses, has been lacking. Concentration on ministerial history, a concentration on institutional history, a limitation of resources, and an assumption, especially in 19th century history, that the public and therefore male sphere of activity is intrinsically more important and easier to access than the private and assumed to be female sphere. And do these reasons account for the lack of traction for this story? Well, I don't think they do, not entirely. It's true that our history writing has concentrated on ministers and institution, but the Deaconesses have been present in ministerial roles, and they have also been, even if tangentially, but also effectively, part of the institution of the Union. But the institution can be a problem for us, and it is in this story. The Deaconess Order was formally part of the institution of the Baptist Union, but it was also anomalous. It fitted neither our norm of local church and minister, nor was it a regular part of the national structure of the Union. Not criticising those, but it's recognising that in the experiment of the order, something new was being tried. There were very close links between the Deaconesses as a group. They understood themselves as belonging together, even when serving in different churches. And there was also at least some pattern of strategic deployment, of looking to see where might a deaconess best be used in an area or a district. And some kind of, I don't want to call it an authority structure because it clearly wasn't, but some kind of oversight outside of the local church. The Deaconess Committee had a sense of a duty of care over the deaconesses, quite apart from the way in which a local church cared for its ministerial workers. And that model doesn't fit our institutional structures, either of union and association or of local church. So while not overlooked in the telling of those stories, it doesn't fit in easily for those who are learning. And so it slides off and it gains little traction and it gets lost. And the question of resources available is a significant one, but even accepting some of what Maurice says, and I actually don't accept everything she says about resources. There are resources. There are minutes of the committee meetings, maybe not for the earliest years, but there are minutes of the committee meetings, committees and councils. There are reports, there are papers of various individuals, there's printed material. Of course, there's room for expansion of which resources we look at. But given that we don't have histories, we don't have resources for a lot of the histories we write, this isn't a sufficient reason for saying we don't know enough about them. And while the role of spheres needs to be examined, the Deaconesses were not in what you would call a private sphere. They were leading services in the streets, as well as in buildings, as well as doing the more private work of visiting homes and working with the individuals. So while these reasons are important for considering why this history is overlooked, they are not sufficient. Now, I started to write this. That phrase, in plain sight, hidden in plain sight, had not yet been attached to the accusations against the TV star that made it such a catchphrase since mid-September. And I certainly don't want to suggest there's anything as sinister or deliberately manipulative in the lack of traction that this history has among us. But I do wonder if there's some hints that might help us. That investigation about the abuse that had gone on, amongst other things, has provoked discussion since, in which people say two significant things. Firstly, we all knew, and we talked about it among ourselves. Women talk about warning each other and protecting each other, but we couldn't or chose not to talk about it because we wouldn't be believed. He had all the power. And secondly, we didn't think it was worth telling the story because it was what happened at the time. It was so commonplace, it didn't seem worth commenting on. It wasn't important enough. Now, say again, I am absolutely not making any link with the lack of this story being heard and suggestions of misconduct or abuse. There's other places for that to be said. But I'm interested in why some stories get told and others don't. Because nobody would listen is something I think to notice. But I think there's more to it than that. I've taught history for a long time now. It is nearly 30 years. And when I started, I was one of several tutors in our colleges teaching church history in various forms, concentrating on Baptist history as part of the formation of Baptist ministries. And that role has gone. I teach history on a sessional basis in our colleges now. I love the way the course is shaped and the emphasis it has, and there is denominational history, but it's half a session. And why is that? Well, there's all kinds of reasons, and this isn't the place to explore them all. But one that I don't often hear mentioned, though maybe I'm just not in the conversation. But one reason I think is a loss of a sense of denomination. And there may be all sorts of good and proper reasons for that. And this isn't the place to go into too much reflection. I suspect it's that we've been praying for church unity and thinking it would look like this, and it's crept up on us in another way. And isn't that just what the Spirit does? Now, there are gains and losses all round this shift in the nature of our relationships to one another and our history. But for many people, it is simply not relevant, and so people don't listen. But knowing who we are and why we are matters, because it shapes how we order our churches and how we organise ourselves nationally and how we have difficult conversations and how we recognise one another and acknowledge our belonging together. And when we don't know the story that has led us here, we run particular dangers of factionalism or becoming something untrue to our past. Now, I'm not saying that just because we did, we should do, but inevitably we are shaped by our past. And so at the very least, understanding that helps us move well into the future. But in terms of not hearing this history of the Deaconesses, I think it's important. There is so much of our history we don't hear, not that we don't tell, but that we don't hear. And we're impoverished by it. We cherry pick the bits that support where we want to be or where we want things to go. Very clearly happening at the moment as we debate the limits of our community. And I've been guilty of it, I confess. But we don't hear the bits of our history that don't fit the story we're trying to tell in the present. And so we lose stuff. So why don't we hear the story of the Deaconesses? What does the lack of hearing about it, tell us about where we're going, where we are, what's going on? Well, one of the marked things about the Deaconesses is they were an order. There was a very strong centre to the movement and a strategic dynamic to do what was done. And it's not that there was no involvement in the local church, there very clearly was. But there was a strong sense of belonging more widely or more deeply than simply to the local. And that shaped the Deaconesses and the way the churches worked with them. And there have been various times and experiences when we've sought some sense of a central strategy, and I think we're in one of those phases now, but it's never easy. And it seems to challenge much of what we value most deeply about being Baptist. That capacity of a local church to be present to and in the locality, responding to God's call to be the body of Christ in this place for this time. But there was something in the activity of the Deaconesses and the way in which they were organised that I suggest challenges both that deep individualism and the seeming desire to find a common way of being that precludes difference. There was strategic thinking and there was local responsiveness. There was a recognition that what was needed and important in one context was not the same in another, and that was fine and could be embraced. And so the Deaconess Committee oversaw and supported Deaconesses, but also assumed that the ministry each sister offered would be different, would be shaped by the context and would change as circumstances change. And I wonder if one of the reasons we don't hear this story is that that's such a different way of doing things that we literally cannot hear it. It doesn't make sense to us in our current situation. And it might, if we listened, offer a model that would challenge some of our self-perception and ask some questions that are uncomfortable. The second reason that was given for not talking about what was happening in the abuse situation was it wasn't important enough. It was so normal, we just didn't think it was worth talking about. And I think that's something worth hearing too. It is true that in recent years, our history has become more and more abbreviated as we've diminished the importance of denominational history in the formation of ministers and by extension and implication, the lives of our congregations. And as our history becomes abbreviated, we concentrate on the highlights, the heroics, the parts that can be weaponized in current controversies. And at the moment, the history of Deaconesses doesn't fit that category, those categories. Rather, it's seen as specialized, as so often the history of women's activities and contexts can be. It's of interest to women, but not to real people. We still live in the inherited culture that assumes, even when the words are different, that there is contextual theology or history, and then there's mainstream, implying non-contextual, read more deeply, white, cis, European, etc., etc. The history of the Deaconesses and the history of the order is not discounted or ignored because of any direct rejection or resistance, just that it's not important. It's specialised. It's not mainstream. And I think there are two other things linked to it for that. To get heard in an increasingly crowded marketplace of things clamouring for attention and of stories, accounts of who we are, what's important, it's necessary to be, the best I can say, is noisy. And though there were among the deaconesses many who were strong and creative and independent-minded women, they were also, on the whole, not people who would blow their own trumpets. These kind of women didn't become deaconesses. It's a comment a retired deaconess made to me when asked why sisters didn't campaign for better training or pay. And that kind of sums it up. And that ethos shaped not just the movement, but the way it talked about itself, and therefore, to some extent, the way it has been talked about. All the deaconesses I've known have been independent and effective ministers and have had in their ministries and in themselves something significantly self-effacing. We haven't heard the story because the story itself reflects the people it is about. It's there. If you look, you can see it, but it won't shout and it won't demand attention. And the accounts of the deaconesses, like many of the churches the deaconesses served, are small, they're unspectacular, they're what we might call ordinary, even in church terms, domestic. And that such stories are not heard is not simply true of deaconesses. It's one of the issues that needs to be faced, for example, when we talk about sharing our finances, giving grants. You will know, I'm sure as I do, of churches that have sought funding from Home Mission and other grant-making bodies, but because what they're doing is not immediately seen as growth or as something special, it doesn't attract attention. It's too quiet. But thirdly, there is, I believe, another and a more uncomfortable reason. And again, it's there in plain sight as Dr. Payne celebrates the order as it finishes. As a denomination, we shut it down. Yes, there was consultation. Yes, there was agreement. Yes, there was a sense of inevitability, since, as Hubble pointed out, there was an overlap with women in ministry, and the existence of deaconesses confused the issue and allowed us not to talk about it. And as Payne pointed out in his closing address, Baptist pride must be touched with a bit of shame, because so many of these stories have been told have behind them a great deal of heroism and heartache, because frankly, we have not as a denomination given them adequate support or recognition. And in closing it down, we lost several important things. We lost an experiment in strategic thinking and creative ministry. We lost an organizedly supportive community of people who were ministering. And significantly, we lost a model of ministry that had been explored by women, but which was not actually of necessity gendered. A form of ministry that in other communities is called diaconal, and it's a very particular form of service. And we have over the last years developed a whole range of recognised ways of serving our churches. I think it's great. We've got pioneers and youth pastors and pastoral workers, family community workers, parish nurses, wellbeing space organisers, and all of them are valuable and creative and fantastic. And I think we can demonstrate that the deaconesses did most of this and more. And we had a way of recognising and forming and affirming such ministry. And yes, it was only open to women, but it didn't need to be. And in losing that, we've had to reinvent it in all sorts of ways, which is great. But did we need to do that? And even more significantly, from the point of view of not hearing the story, I think it is a wound that is not healed. When the order closed, the active deaconesses were given the choice, resign or become ministers. And not all of them wanted to. And several left. But of those who became ministers, it wasn't just a straightforward move from one title to another. So I want to end with a personal story that seems to me to highlight the woundedness of this experience. Now, this is a small part of what I hope will be a much more significant piece of work. And it's about the person Dr. Payne called the last deaconess standing, Barbara Stamford. Barbara trained at St Andrew's Hall in Selly Oak in the late 1950s, and she started her service at Bloomsbury as the last deaconess there in 1960. And she retired when I went there as minister in 2006, and she'd mentored me as a student, and she supported me as a minister 25 years later, and she was amazing. The order closed in 1975. Barbara was not ordained to the ministry until the early 90s. And she used to say it was because she never got the letter. I have her papers. When she died, she left them to me. And the letter's there. And rather, I think it was she did not want to be a minister. She was called to be a deaconess, and that was taken away from her. She exemplified the self-effacement I've mentioned, and she would never have stood up and argued noisily about that. She just never got around to changing her status until she did. And that was because she saw her Anglican friends getting ordained and realised what it meant to them and felt she wanted to stand with them. Now, Barbara would not describe herself as wounded in any way. And it's not wounds to individual people I'm talking about here and trying to make sense of. They're there, that's not my point. Rather, it's the injury done by and therefore to our community. There are silences in our history, things we find hard to talk about because there's pain. There are hard memories, there are lingering discomforts. The Christological controversy in the 70s, for example, it's alluded to, it's not discussed, it's shut down. And I suggest the Deaconess order comes into that category because while we are collectively, or rather there was a collective discomfort, and so the story wasn't told for a while, and not being told, it gradually faded. Now we hear vague rumours, but because of all the other reasons we've mentioned, the story is not deeply present for us in the way that, for example, the stories of Carey or Spurgeon or others are. The story's there in plain sight, and we're losing the people who remember it. But it has so much to offer us. So please, let's hear it. Let's investigate it and reclaim it. For in that is not only a resource for us as women in ministry, but for our whole community exploring ministry in all its varieties of forms, and for healing and re-owning part of who we have been and therefore who we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And thank you, everybody, as well, for showing Ruth that appreciation for that fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I really feel like, you know, you're rehabilitating Deaconesses really to where they should be. Thank you. It was so interesting.